Welcome back. Now, burnout is a form of exhaustion caused by constantly feeling swamped. It's a result of excessive and prolonged emotional, physical, and mental stress. In many cases, burnout is related to one's job. Burnout happens when you're overwhelmed, emotionally drained, and unable to keep up with life's incessant demands. Now, joining us tonight for this discussion is Jessie Strauss, who is a psychological counselor. Jessie, good evening and welcome to the Daily Roundup.
Good evening, Nina. How are you?
I'm good. How are you doing?
I'm doing very well.
Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me, finally.
I want to start by talking about, what I just mentioned in the intro, the fact that burnout is commonly related to one's job. How true is this? How factual is this?
It is actually the most common form of burnout is occupational burnout. But not only does it relate to one's job, but it can also affect students, parents, and caregivers as well. Or anyone who works in a high stress and high stressful, demanding environment, and who experience chronic stress over a prolonged period of time with heavy workloads. A recent study that I read was that they did a study in sub-Saharan African countries, and some of the high-income countries had reported from their general working population that about 13 to 27% of people actually struggle with burnout or suffer from burnout because it is a psychological syndrome, so it's a cluster of symptoms. And a lot of doctors, nurses, and teachers, they actually experience high levels of burnout, and there have actually been studies done in Namibia about that as well. So it does relate to one's job, and I think it also relates a lot to the fact that we have this culture or this belief that people have glamorized grinding and overworking, and you need to stay on top of your game, almost overworking yourself like a machine. And I think that contributes a lot to people getting burnt out as it relates to their jobs. But also, other factors that affect it is feeling out of control, not having autonomy within the workplace, not being able to make your own decisions or have any say when it comes to your working hours or the amount of work that you do. Another one is feeling uncertain about your role in your job, because you'll either then feel like you're not doing enough or you overcompensate and do too much. And lack of support. Lack of support within the workplace is a big one. So to come back to your question, occupational burnout is a big, it's the most common one.
Most common one.
Yes.
What are the common signs that indicate that you're approaching burnout? Because as we mentioned, I mentioned in the intro that it's a prolonged experience of emotional, physical, and mental stress. So how does it go that long without being checked?
You are 100% correct, and it's interesting that you're asking that question, because burnout often gets I would say it shares common symptoms with depression. So people might often think that they are struggling with depression, whereas depression is a mental disorder, and burnout is, like I said, a psychological syndrome. But burnout has three distinct key features to it. It's exhaustion. So it's you're feeling physically exhausted, drained, you don't have energy, and then emotional and mental exhaustion as well. So feeling too tired to do anything, having to drag yourself out of bed in the mornings. And with that draining of energy, there's a lack of productivity.
Yes.
And you feel helpless and hopeless, which then leads to the next key one, which is cynicism and sort of detachment and depersonalization. So cynicism, your attitude towards your work is affected negatively, and towards yourself and others as well. And then almost becoming detached from your environment as well as yourself, because if you work yourself like a machine, not paying attention to your needs and taking care of yourself, you tend to lose touch with yourself and what your needs are. And then the third one is feeling a lack of accomplishment. So you don't feel like you're doing well in your job, and you tend to procrastinate, and you just feel ineffective, and your performance starts going down because you can't apply yourself or engage yourself to your work anymore. So those three things together are three things that you need to sort of pay attention to and start to notice if you're starting to feel like that, even if it is your passion and you start feeling negative towards it because of the workload and because of the stress. You need to evaluate and see where you are at.
Jessie, before we run out of time, perhaps just lastly you can tell us what interventions can one take and as early as possible, obviously.
Okay, I don't want us to run out of time, but trying to change your work patterns and to work less hours and set some boundaries. That is not always possible, not with all professions.
Yes.
So if you can't change your environment, you try and look within. So maybe speaking to someone, speaking to your supervisor, speaking to colleagues to see what you can come up with to make the work environment a bit more conducive so that you're more engaged. Also social support, family and friends, prioritizing time with them and not just focusing on your work and burning yourself out by doing too much in your work, but also prioritizing time for relaxation, spending time with friends and family. And another big one is prioritizing your health and your fitness, so that you can just put back in what you take out.
Are those tools that you mentioned, can they also be considered self-care tools, or is that
It can. I would actually say one of the most important ones, self-care tools, is practicing mindfulness and breathing techniques. Because mindfulness helps us become more present and more aware, not only internally but to our environment as well. And once we are aware and we can feel any type of change or stress come up, we learn to cultivate wisdom. And your
response mechanisms are better.
Yes, and your response mechanisms are better, and you also learn a lot about yourself, what works for you, what is helpful, what can, ease some of the stress and help you manage that stress. And the breathing exercises work really well in helping you regulate between your parasympathetic and your sympathetic nervous system, which is responsible for your stress response.
Thank you.
So, yeah.
Jessie,
there's a lot more. We can talk about it the whole evening, but yeah.
Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you
for
for
your time.
having me.
We're going to take a short break. When we come back, it's time for entertainment. Stay with us.